King Lear. Lear, the son of Balderdal, reigned over the British in 3105 to create the world. In those days Joaz reigned in Judea. Read Shakespeare in the Chronicles of Golinshed, one of his favorite books. The tale led away to ancient times. Imagine a time, writes Victor Hugo, only a temple is built in Jerusalem, the gardens of Semiramis, which are already 900 years old, begin to decline. Gold coins are minted for the first time in Aegina, the scales of Argos, the tyrant of Argos. The scales have just been invented. The Chinese for the first time began to calculate the times of solar eclipses. Homer, if he is still alive, a century-old man, Lycurgus, an observant traveler, returned to Sparta. Such was the time when Lear reigned on the mist-shrouded islands. In the tragedy of Shakespeare, Lear swears, the sacred radiation of the sun, the secrets of Hecate and the night. He compares himself with an angry dragon. Lear and Kent swear by Apollo, the sun god. And indeed, the ancient British worshipped the sun. After the Roman conquest, the British learned from the Romans the art of bronze sculpture. Among the monuments of the latter there is often a snake with a crest, a dragon. Hecate, the three-headed goddess of the underworld, the goddess of the ancient world, who survived under Zeus from the time of the Titans, is one of the archaic images of ancient mythology, the one who at the crossroads sacrificed dogs, honeycombs and black lambs. The thought of Shakespeare went into the darkness of distant centuries. Why was this antiquity to Shakespeare? We know that always and everywhere he talked about his modernity. But in each individual work he chose a certain side of this modernity and found the corresponding background for it. Chanting the fiery love of two young men of his time, he chose the southern sky of Italy, mentioned the plane tree grove in which Romeo in love wanders, about the flowering pomegranate tree growing in the garden of the Capulet, on which the nightingale sings. Swan song of the Renaissance, if you can call it, Antony and Cleopatra, sounded against the background of the refined decadent Hellenistic Egypt. Shakespeare sought to convey the severity of his age, and before him emerged the outline of the castle in Elsinore, the northern sky with a sparkling star on it. Together with the Prince of Denmark, he felt a piercing cold wind, so it was with King Lear. This ancient foggy gloomy world harmonized with the brutal nature of the reality surrounding Shakespeare, with the very essence of this reality. Let us recall the scene of Gloucester's blindness, nowhere in Shakespeare's unrivaled cruelty. It is no accident that the images of predatory animals are mentioned especially often in the text of King Lear. Along with them, there are always images of physical suffering. So, for example, at the end of the tragedy, Kent compares the world with the brutal rack, an instrument of torture, tormenting the exhausted old man. And, finally, the contradiction between luxury and poverty, which Shakespeare saw in the life around him, found a symbolic expression in contrasting the lush hall of the royal castle, the beginning of the tragedy of that gloomy, deserted, ancient steppe, through which, on a stormy night, and the only inhabitants of which are an owl and a wolf. The first story of the old British king and his ungrateful daughters was written in Latin at the beginning of the 12th century. During the XVI century, this story was retold several times in verse and in prose. Variants of it are found in the Chronicles of Golinshed and other authors of the 16th century. In the early 90s of the XVI century on the London stage was a play about King Lear. Unlike the Shakespearean tragedy, the Shakespearean Lear in all its variants comes to a happy ending. Lear and Cordelia are finally rewarded. In their well-being, they seem to merge with the surrounding reality, assimilate with it. On the contrary, the positive heroes of Shakespeare's tragedy rise above this reality. This is their greatness and at the same time a doom. If the wound inflicted by Lear's poisoned sword did not prove to be fatal, Hamlet still could not reign over the world of Osric, the new Rosencrantz, Guildenstern and Polonive, as he could not return to peaceful Wittenberg. If the fuzz on the lips of Cordelia stirred and she came to life, Lear, who saw a lot, as the Duke of Alba News says about him in the final words of the tragedy, still could not return to that magnificent hall of the royal castle where we saw him at the beginning of the tragedy. He could not, wandering with his head uncovered in the storm and the rain on the night step, where, poor, naked unhappy people remembered him, and content himself with the secluded and serene refuge that Cordelia would have created for him. In the pre-Shakespearean versions of Lear there is no scene in the nocturnal step, as there is no jester in them, a bearer of folk wisdom. Shakespeare's tragedy differs from his sources primarily in the setting of a humanistic, truly Shakespearean problem. The lyre on the throne, the Olympian, surrounded by the splendor of the courtyard. The initial scene is undoubtedly the most magnificent in the whole tragedy, is far from the terrible reality behind the castle walls. Crown, royal mantle, titles are in his eyes sacred attributes and possess the fullness of reality. Blinded by servile worship during the long years of his reign, he accepted this external brilliance for a true essence. Why was he not able to renounce power, income and government, since the royal dignity, which in itself had a reality in his eyes, was preserved for him? We retained the name and title of the king, says Lear. But under the external shine nothing turned out, nothing will come of nothing, as the old king himself said. He became, according to the jester, zero without a number. A regal garment fell from her shoulders, a veil fell from her eyes, and Lear first saw the world of unvarnished reality, a cruel world over which Regan, Goneril and Edmunda reigned. Olympia is overthrown on the bare ground. Deprived of royal power, Lear saw himself as poor, sick, infirm, despised by the old man. The gloomy steppe along which, at night, in a storm and rain, the homeless Lear is wandering around and amongst whom the hobster of a crazy vagabond sticks out lonely, as it embodies the gloomy background of the Shakespearean era. In the nocturnal steppe, the enlightened Lear says, "You, poor, naked unhappy people, wherever you have met the storm, how will you endure a night like this? With an empty stomach, in a rubbish hole without shelter over the homeless sex. Who shelter you, the poor? So little about you I thought. Luxury, learn, oh learn the very suffering of the poor. Shake off excess, it is for their benefit, and prove that the sky is true." Translated by A.V. Druzhinen. In none of his works did Shakespeare show the evolution of the image as fully as in the central figure of King Lear. In the course of developing events, not only does Lear himself change, the attitude of the viewer or reader to him also changes. Looking at him, Lyra, observes Nadobraliubov, we first feel hatred for this desperate despot, but following the development of the drama we are increasingly reconciling with him as a man and ending with being filled with indignation and burning. It is no longer malicious for him, not for the whole world, for that wild, inhuman situation, which can lead to such rancor. Even people like Liru Nadobraliubov, The Dark Kingdom. In the book, Nadobraliubov, Complete Works, Goslitas. Volume 2, 1935, p. 71. S. M. Mikoels in the role of Lear. The scene in the steppe is the moment of complete fall of Lear. He was thrown out of society. An unequipped man, he says, is just a poor, naked, two-legged animal. And at the same time this scene is his greatest victory. On this stormy night he understood what the jester knew from the very beginning, who had long known the truth. No wonder Lear calls him a bitter buffoon. Fate, a debaucher of libertines. The jester sings, "You'll never open the door to the poor." Life around, as her fool sees, is ugly distorted. It is necessary that everything in it changed. Then the time will come, who will live to see it? When they start to walk with their feet, the jester sings. He is a fool. And meanwhile, unlike court Lear, he upholds human dignity to the end. Following the Lear, The clown manifests genuine honesty and is conscious of it himself, and that gentleman, the jester sings, who serves for profit and seeks benefits, and who only follows his lord in appearance, will take his feet when the rain begins, and leave you, but I'll stay. The fool will not go away, let the sage flee. The runaway scoundrel looks like a jester, but he's a jester, by God, not a scoundrel. So, the fool already from the very beginning possessed that wisdom, which, having thrown off the royal mantle and crown, only through severe sufferings did Lear find. The same freedom is acquired by the blinded Gloucester, who, in his own words, stumbled when he was seeing. Now, blind, he sees the truth. He calls to heaven as a symbol of justice. Let a man who has a surplus and satiated luxury, who turns the law into his slave and who does not want to see, because he does not feel, will soon feel your power. Then the distribution will destroy excess, and everyone will get enough means of subsistence. The fate of Gloucester is shown in parallel with the fate of Lear. Gloucester is the victim of Edmund. Offended by his position of an illegitimate son, Edmund in many ways resembles and embittered by his ugliness of Richard and, to a greater extent, Iago, stung by the fact that he was circumvented by the service. The main theme of King Lear is the tragedy of knowing the cruel reality that surrounded Shakespeare. For the disclosure of this topic, a remarkable performer of the role of Lear on the Soviet Zine, S.M. Nichols, who rightly can be called an actor-philosopher, has done a lot.